I wanted to talk today about anxiety. And obviously, that is a very broad term. There are lots of different types of anxiety. But for me, one that affects me most is social anxiety. And I think we've seen the biggest numbers of social anxiety that we've ever seen, particularly since lockdown. And it's got me thinking a lot about what does and doesn't make my anxiety worse. And so I wanted to have a cup of tea and I thought we would discuss it. And I would love to hear how social anxiety manifests in your life and also what you do about it. Like how, particularly if you feel like you've gotten over it or you've managed to conquer it, mention in the comments as always, because this is a really interactive community and it's great to see people sharing their own stories on the channel. So I shared a story a few days ago about where I thought the roots of my social anxiety came from. And I think it's perfectly understandable that if you feel like you've experienced some kind of rejection, that one of the natural things that you'd want to do is to run away, to hide away from that, because it is a painful feeling. It's a painful feeling being embarrassed and particularly around lots of people. And so I think most people will find that they have their root or their core of their social anxiety in some kind of event that happened in their past. And I discussed that story and it wasn't easy for me to talk about, but the reason that I did it was because I feel like it's important that people be open and share those things. And I know that there's a lot of people that have never talked about these traumatic events that they've had in their past before. And if I can do it on camera to thousands of strangers, you can do it once to a professional that's there to look after you and to help you. So I've talked in the past about what I did as a result of feeling that rejection and embarrassment. And that for me was to hide away and to turn to drink and drugs because they helped me to kind of numb myself. And video games, again, was another one of those things. And I think, at least the impression I've got from the comments, is that a lot of you guys can relate to that because you've been through a similar thing in the past. And let's face it, like, who hasn't had some kind of embarrassing, traumatic event happen when they're in their teenage years? I guess the big issue comes from when we give it meaning and when we don't have support or someone to tell us that actually it's not as bad as we think it is. And we give it this meaning that's much more, we give it much more significance than it should warrant. And so we do, we retreat back into ourselves and we hide away from the thing that we don't want to be exposed to again. And I think that's a perfectly natural response. Like, we learn this as kids, you know, you don't touch the stove because it's red hot and it will hurt, and you only have to do it once to know, and then you'll never want to do it again because you know it's painful. But the problem with social anxiety is that I think so much of our fulfillment and at the very core of our beings, we are social creatures. And so you've got that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I think community and socializing is a massive part of that. And I think I read a study somewhere a while ago that actually loneliness was one of the biggest killers. And I certainly experienced this years ago when I used to be a carer. And I would find quite often that I would look after 90-year-olds or sometimes even 100-year-olds that were actually really sprightly and had all their marbles and were really awesome people to be around. And then I would meet people that were sometimes in their 60s or maybe even their 50s who were very frail and really struggling just with the basics in life. And the common denominator that I saw between the two of them is that those that were struggling the most typically were the most isolated, and those that were doing really well were the ones that had these big support networks or families or at least a couple of friends or someone that they can rely on and speak to and have that kind of emotional connection with. So, unlike the stove, you can't just shy away from speaking to people, because that comes with its own set of problems. And I think the biggest thing that hurt me when I did run away from those experiences, when I did hide away, was exactly that. It was hiding away from the world and not interacting with people. And of course, the more time you spend on your own, the more time you get used to doing it, and the less you get used to being around people. And so then, because you're not used to doing it, being around people can make you feel anxious, and that in turn makes you want to avoid it. And this whole horrible circle, just you get stuck in this downward cycle. And that's exactly what I do, and I still do occasionally from time to time, is that I will experience a social event that I'm uncomfortable with, and then I will unconsciously hide away until such a time where I realise I've spent a lot of time on my own, and I probably shouldn't have done, and now I find it much more difficult to get back out there again, because socialising is a skill, and I think anybody can learn it. And sure, there are certain people that are more inclined, they're more naturally gifted at socializing, and you can see this even in like young kids. You get some young kids that are quite shy, and they don't really want to speak to strangers, especially. And then you get some kids that are really outgoing. So there is an element of it that is natural. It's in our biology or whatever. But certainly, socializing itself is a set of skills that you can learn to improve your social life. And skills require practice, and if you are out of practice, then you are going to find it difficult. And I guess that's like anything. Like, I play guitar from time to time, and there have been times when I've been practicing religiously and gotten pretty good. And now my guitar has been hung up in my office for probably a year, and I haven't picked it up. And I guarantee that if I was to pick up that guitar now, I would be a long way off being able to play how I used to. And so socializing is just like that. And I realise, especially lately, that that is a pit I have fallen back into. And I have spent a lot of time um, working from home. At this stage in my life, it is easier for me to do that because I have other projects going on and some family stuff that I need to be close by for. And so it is more convenient for me to be at home. But I know certainly I feel better on a day-to-day basis if I go into the office, even though it's more inconvenient. And I think that's purely because even if I'm not necessarily talking to people, just being in an environment like that, being a part of a community, is is a boost. So back to my original point, I think when I've tried to analyse where I became so socially anxious, I don't think it was the event itself that caused the social anxiety. It wasn't the embarrassment that I felt in that moment. It was my reaction to it. And that reaction was to hide away from people and to stop talking to people. And of course, the more time I spent on my own, the more I demonized that particular environment and the less I wanted to be in it. Whereas actually, probably the best thing to do at the time was to go straight back in and start socializing again, and realizing that probably within a week or two that whole thing would have blown over and life would have just returned back to normal. But I didn't, and I spent at least a year of my life hiding away. I'd like to know how social anxiety manifested for you and whether you can relate to any of this. Like, did you have a particular experience in your life, and then your choice to deal with that was to hide away from the event? And also on the flip side, if you've had an event like that and you've confronted it, and think about this, because I think for a lot of people, if you were to, there's probably been a lot of events in your life where you have had a completely different attitude that someone else may have done. And so an event that seemed like nothing to you may actually have been quite traumatic. for someone else. So if you feel like there was an event that could have been traumatic and you decided to confront the situation or to push through the situation, then again, let me know. I've heard people on the comments say before that they felt really nervous and anxious going into a new job or a new office, or a new group, like a martial arts group or boxing group or something like that. Um, Let me know what happened when you just persevered with it. Like, how anxious were you feeling in the beginning, and how did you feel after like a period of time going there more regularly? Because for me, I do spend a lot of time in my own head. I'm very aware of that, and because of that, I try and create logical reasons why for everything. I try to assess why this happens and why that happens. And I have spent countless hours researching all the internet, all these particular causes of anxiety, and I have had God knows how many blood tests and tried so many different supplements to see if it could be something externally that's affecting me. And ultimately, I've tried God knows how many different diets, different kinds of exercise routines. Um, there are so many different things that I've tried, and when I really look back in on my life at the times where I felt generally the most fulfilled, sometimes I was doing all or some, if not all, of the things that you really shouldn't do if you do experience anxiety. Like, I may have been drinking caffeine, I may have been smoking, I may have been eating processed foods, and despite all of that, I still felt really good. And I can think of two examples off the top of my head. The first time when I was in India, which was in 2020, April 2020, um, I hadn't smoked for ages, and for some reason I started smoking again when I was out there. But I met a group of people, and I felt suddenly like I was part of a community. I initially went out there on my own to experience it, but because of all the drama that was happening around trying to get a flight home, I ended up meeting up with a group of people, and we were all helping each other out. We all felt like we were bonded over this particular issue. And what I suddenly realised is that I didn't need to drink to feel confident. I didn't need to use any of my normal coping mechanisms because it felt totally normal to just socialise and interact with these people. And I was smoking, which normally gives me anxiety and sometimes panic attacks. And I wasn't eating particularly well either. And despite that, I still felt really good. And there's another good example I can think of where every year a big group of us used to get together and go camping for my birthday. And this was, again, probably the last time we did it was like 2018. And anyone I invited was free to invite other people as well, and it just ended up becoming this real great community feel and spirit. And back then, I would have had a fair amount to drink. I would have smoked. I would have been drinking coffee. We would have been eating nothing but processed and barbecued food, and we would have slept terribly as well in a tent in a wet tent on a hard floor. And yet, despite all of that, even when I was hungover after that weekend, I still felt really good. And sometimes I like to put the blinders on, and I like to pretend that actually it can't be that. It can only be, it has to be this particular vitamin deficiency. Like, maybe I've got a vitamin D deficiency, or maybe my testosterone's low, or maybe I need to cut wheat out of my diet, or maybe I need to cut all kind of coffee out. There's so many different things that my brain wants me to try before I reach the inevitable conclusion, which is I just need to get used to actually being around people. It's as simple as that. It doesn't need to be more complicated. Like, as I mentioned earlier, socializing is just a skill, and because I've not been practicing that skill for a while, I feel rusty and I feel anxious, and I feel like the consequences of messing up with that skill are embarrassment, I guess, which is going to take me straight back to where I was originally as this 15, 16-year-old kid, and I don't want that. And so it's much easier to pretend that it's, or to convince myself that it's something else when it's actually not. And I know this. I know this like deep down, and when I'm actually honest, and when I have these sessions where I reflect on these things, it's the only inevitable conclusion. And I know that I probably need to set some clear goals on exactly what I'm going to do to be more social. And that was an idea for a video that I had, was to try and do, not necessarily change anything that I'm doing now, but just do everything I normally do, but more socially. Like, for instance, if I want to play video games, that's fine, but I play them online with people. And maybe if I want to go for a run, I find someone to go for a run with. If I'm working, maybe I can find a group, that a work from home group or something like that, and maybe that involves going into the office a bit more as well, because I know it's really the biggest thing that I can do. I talk a lot about levers, like we can pull all of these levers in our life that have these different effects, and some of those levers have minute effects that we might not even realize, and other levers have huge effects on our life. And for me, the biggest lever that I can pull is just being around people more often and building a life where I am around people more often, and that's what I need to do. So, as always in these videos, I've gone off on a bit of a ramble, but would love to hear your experiences of anxiety, and particularly for those that are doing something about it. What did you do to change it, and what have you done recently that, or in the past, that has made, that it has diminished your anxiety or even got rid of it? And particularly, what we're talking about here is social anxiety and a fear of rejection or embarrassment or something like that. Anyway, thanks for tuning in as always. Cheers.